Chapter 1. Introduction. What is crime? Terms and concepts. The history of crime is a mirror of human history. From the first tribal societies to the highly complex states of our time, the question of how a community deals with violations of its rules arises again and again. Crime is not a fixed, timeless term, but a construct that is always shaped by the culture, values, and power structure of a society. What was considered a serious crime in one era could be seen as a trivial offense or even legitimate behavior in another. In order to understand the development of the criminal system, one must first be clear about what is meant by crime and how this term changed. Today, crime is usually defined as behavior that violates applicable law and is therefore punishable. However, this definition is relatively recent, as it presupposes the existence of a codified legal system and a functioning state. In early societies, in which oral traditions, customs, and religious taboos regulated coexistence, there was no written criminal law in the modern sense. Nevertheless, a violation of order could have serious consequences: expulsion from the community, acts of revenge, or even death penalties. It already becomes clear here that crime is always also a social attribution. It only arises when a community defines behavior as inadmissible. The term crime is derived from the Latin crimen, which means accusation, guilt, or crime. Even in Roman law, this meant an act that was not only considered unlawful, but also punishable. Linked to this term is the idea of punishment and atonement, of a balance between perpetrator, victim, and community. Crime is therefore not only an individual misconduct, but always also a social conflict. Particularly interesting is the question of the relativity of the criminal. What counts as a crime depends heavily on the norms of the time. In ancient Rome, for example, it was taken for granted that slaves had no rights and that killing them by the owner was not necessarily punishable. Today, this would be a most serious crime against human rights. The situation is similar with crimes such as heresy or witchcraft, which triggered entire trials and executions in the Middle Ages, but no longer exist in modern societies. This shows that crime is not a natural fact, but a social construct that changes over the centuries. Another dimension is the distinction between criminal and deviant. Not every behavior that violates social norms is automatically punishable. Deviations can also take fashionable, cultural, or moral forms, which arouse displeasure but are not prosecuted. Crime, on the other hand, marks the threshold at which a society recognizes such grave injustice that it uses state violence to respond to it. The boundary between deviant and criminal behavior is fluid, and it is precisely this shift that makes the history of crime so exciting. The relationship between perpetrator and victim is also central. In early societies, the focus was often on making amends. If someone harmed another, it was the task of the offender's family or clan to compensate, whether through payment, through a symbolic act, or through offerings to the gods. It was only later that the idea developed that an offense affects not only the victim, but also the order of the state or community. Crime thus became a public concern, and punishment served not only as reparation, but also as a deterrent and confirmation of state authority. An error occurred while translating "please try again." The emergence of crime-fighting institutions is closely linked to this development. It was only with the construction of complex states that the need to create police, courts, and prisons arose. But mechanisms of social control existed long before that. Councils of elders, tribal leaders, or religious authorities had the task of settling conflicts and punishing offenses. Crime in a broader sense thus includes not only laws and punishments, but also all forms of social reaction to deviation, from social ostracism to state violence. In the modern age, new forms of thinking about crime have developed. Criminology as a science emerged in the 19th century and attempted to systematically record the causes and manifestations of crime. For a long time, biological or psychological factors were in the foreground before social and economic conditions were increasingly investigated in the 20th century. Today we know that crime is a complex phenomenon that cannot be traced back to a single cause. Poverty, inequality, lack of education, but also personal dispositions or cultural factors all play together. This insight still influences the way in which crime is understood and fought today. Crime is therefore more than just the history of laws and punishments. It is the story of a constant negotiation between the individual and society, between order and freedom, between security and justice. Each epoch had to redefine what it defines as crime and how it reacts to it. It is in this field of tension that the big questions arise that still occupy us today. Should punishment deter or improve? Should it be hard or humane? Is crime a consequence of individual guilt or social conditions? And what are the limits of state power when it comes to establishing security? Dealing with the history of crime shows that there are no definitive answers. Each society creates its own definitions, its own institutions, and its own forms of reaction. But one thing remains constant: the need to deal with violations of the rules is part of the essence of every community. Crime is therefore as old as humanity itself, an eternal struggle between order and chaos, between right and wrong. This script will trace this path, from the first tribal rules to the modern theories of criminology, from the blood feudal societies of the early days to the digital fight against crime of the 21st century. Chapter by chapter, it will become apparent how not only the definition of crime, but also the methods of combating it have changed. This makes it clear that anyone who studies the history of crime not only learns something about crime and punishment, but also about the deepest structures of human community and about the way in which societies understand themselves. Chapter 2. Crime in Prehistory and Early History. The question of criminality in prehistory and early history takes us back to an era in which there were no states, no written laws, and no institutions in the modern sense. And yet the coexistence of people was still determined by rules at that time. Wherever people lived together in groups, norms, taboos, and ideas of what was allowed and what was forbidden emerged. Criminality in this early period therefore does not mean the violation of legal paragraphs, but the crossing of boundaries set by custom, religion, or tribal authority. Archaeological finds give us few direct indications of crime and punishment in prehistory. But anthropology and anthropology allow us to draw conclusions by showing us how today's or recently existing tribal societies deal with conflicts. In small groups, as was typical in the Paleolithic age, social life was based on mutual trust and cooperation. Hunter-gatherers had to work together to procure food and ward off danger. In such a community, deviation, such as theft, betrayal, or violence within the group, was an existential problem that threatened the survival of all. Sanctions against deviant behavior were often immediate and collective. Anyone who opposed the group risked not only loss of reputation, but also exclusion or even death. In some tribal societies, there was a practice of banishing individuals who had broken serious taboos into the wilderness. Since survival alone was almost impossible, this was tantamount to a death penalty. Other communities relied on symbolic forms of punishment, ridicule, social ostracism, or the telling of stories denouncing the offenses of the perpetrator. Crime was thus not only an individual misstep, but a break with the moral and spiritual order. A particularly important aspect of early history was the connection between law and religion. Many taboos had a spiritual basis. Violating a religious commandment, whether it was violating a sacred place, eating forbidden food, or breaking an oath, was considered not only an insult to the community, but also an attack on the gods or ancestors. Punishment was therefore not only a human matter, but was seen as necessary to restore balance with the supernatural powers. Rituals, sacrifices, or acts of purification are therefore often just as much a part of conflict management as material reparation. With the transition to sedentary life in the Neolithic age, the criminal system also changed. The possession of land, animals, and supplies led to property crimes coming to the fore. While hunter-gatherer groups tended to share collectively and property played a minor role, agricultural societies developed a greater awareness of property rights. Theft, embezzlement, or the destruction of property now became serious offenses. At the same time, the larger communities meant that personal ties were less close, and with it the need to define norms more clearly and to sanction violations more severely. An early instrument for conflict resolution was blood revenge. If a member of a clan or family was killed or seriously injured, it was a duty of the relatives to harm the perpetrator or his clan as well. This was not so much an expression of revenge in the modern sense, but served to restore the balance between the groups. However, blood feuds could drag on for generations and cause endless feuds. Therefore, mechanisms developed early on to break this spiral. An important means was the payment of reparations, the so-called Wergeld, which existed in many cultures. The crime was symbolically atoned for by material compensation, and the affected groups were able to make peace again. It is interesting to note that in this early period there was no clear separation between civil and criminal law aspects. A theft, an injury, or a killing were both private and public matters. The community had an interest in restoring harmony, but the responsibility lay with those directly involved and their families. It was only much later, with the formation of state structures, that crime became a matter between the perpetrator and the state. Violence against one's own community also played a central role. Murder, betrayal, or sorcery were considered the most serious offenses in many cultures. While property crimes could be settled by compensation, betrayal was often punishable by death. Anyone who put the group in danger by passing on secret information or letting enemies into the camp destroyed the foundation of collective survival. It was similar with sorcery or witchcraft, which in many early societies were considered the cause of illness or misfortune. The suspicion that someone has caused harm through supernatural means could lead to deadly rituals or lynching. With the increasing complexity of societies, early forms of organized violence also emerged. Even in early history, evidence of bands of robbers or raids on other tribes can be found. These acts of violence were often not seen as crime in the strict sense, but as a legitimate form of securing resources. But within a community, such attacks were clearly condemned. The distinction between internal criminality and external enmity is a consistent pattern throughout history. What is considered a crime internally can appear to the outside world as a heroic act. Early history thus clearly shows that crime has been part of human life from the very beginning. There is no society without norms and no community without transgression of them. Even the smallest groups develop strategies to punish offenses, restore order, and ensure social peace. The spectrum fluctuated between ritual cleansing, symbolic reparation, and brutal punishment. When we look at these early forms of crime today, we see many continuities. The idea of reparation lives on in modern civil law. The public display of punishment can be found in media-accompanied trials, and the fear of invisible threats is reminiscent of old ideas of sorcery. At the same time, the methods and institutions of our time are fundamentally different. The loose rules of small tribes have become complex legal systems, and blood feuds have developed into a state-regulated penal system. But the roots go back a long way, to the era in which people began to order coexistence through rules and to perceive their violation as a threat. Thus, prehistory and early history form the foundation for what is later called criminal history. It was here that the first norms, the first punishments, and the first ideas of justice emerged. They show us that crime is not a modern phenomenon, but as old as humanity itself. Chapter 3: Criminal Law in Ancient Egypt. When you look at the criminal system in ancient Egypt, you are immersed in a world that was characterized by religious ideas, hierarchical structures, and a deep belief in the divine order. For thousands of years, the empire on the Nile was one of the most enduring civilizations in human history, and this permanence was based not least on a complex system of rules and norms that organized coexistence. In this society, crime was not only an attack on the individual or on the community, but above all a violation of the cosmic principle of Maat, the symbol of truth, order, and justice. In ancient Egypt, the Maat was more than just an abstract value. It was a divine force that held the cosmos together. Every person, from the pharaoh to the farmer, was obliged to live according to it. The pharaoh himself was considered the guardian of the Maat and thus the supreme judge and guarantor of justice. Criminality therefore meant not only that a person violated a law, but that he endangered the divine order. In this respect, Egyptian criminal law differs fundamentally from modern legal concepts. It was not only pragmatic, but also deeply religiously charged. Written sources on Egyptian criminal law are rare, but clear structures can be seen from inscriptions, papyrus scrolls, and later Greco-Roman reports. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where the Codex Hammurabi offered a clear list of offenses and punishments, Egyptian law seems to have been less codified. There were collections of legal norms, but they did not have the character of a universally valid code of law, but were rather guidelines that were applied on a case-by-case basis. The currency of the Maat was always decisive. The most important instance of justice was the pharaoh, but he could not decide every dispute personally. Therefore, he delegated his judicial power to officials, judges, and priests. These functionaries formed a kind of early bureaucracy that had great experience and whose task it was to make judgments in the sense of the divine order. Justice was especially pronounced in the temples, as they were considered places where the gods were present. The crimes that were prosecuted in ancient Egypt can be divided into several categories. Property crimes played a central role, as possessions, especially land, crops, and livestock, were crucial for survival. Theft was severely punished, especially if it was directed against temples or the state. Whoever stole sacred property was not only committing a crime against the community, but also a sacrilege against the gods. Inscriptions report drastic punishments for grave robbers who not only committed material injustice, but also disturbed the peace of the dead and thus endangered life in the afterlife. Violent crimes such as assault or homicide were also known in ancient Egypt and were strictly prosecuted. Murder was considered an attack on the divine order and could be punished with death. It is interesting that the religious idea also played a role here. Whoever killed a person not only injured the life of an individual, but also upset the balance of the Maat. The punishment served not only as a deterrent, but also to restore this balance. Another central field was the question of loyalty and betrayal. Since the pharaoh was considered a divine ruler, any attack on his person or authority was a most serious crime. High treason, conspiracies, or riots were mercilessly prosecuted. In some cases, not only the perpetrators but also their families were punished to eradicate any trace of disloyalty. The famous conspiracies in the harem under Ramses III show that such trials were often spectacular and moved the entire society. The punishments in ancient Egypt were varied and ranged from fines to corporal punishment and the death penalty. Corporal punishment was widespread and was used not only for punishment but also for intimidation. Brand marks or mutilations, such as cutting off the nose or ears, had a double function. They punished the perpetrator and at the same time visibly stigmatized him as a criminal. Offenses against the state or religion were punished particularly harshly. The death penalty could be carried out by drowning, burning, or impaling. Grave robbers were sometimes forced to return their loot before they were executed, a symbolic act intended to restore order. In addition to the harsh punishments, however, there were also elements of reparation and reconciliation. In many cases, attempts were made to compensate for the damage through material compensation. Anyone who had stolen something not only had to return it, but often had to replace it many times over. This principle is reminiscent of the Wergeld systems of other early cultures and shows that it was not only about retribution, but also about the practical restoration of order. Of particular importance in Egyptian criminal law was the role of truth. Lies and false statements were considered serious offenses because they hurt the mate. In court, witnesses were rigorously scrutinized, and false testimony could be severely punished. This emphasis on truth is also evident in the religious ideas of the afterlife. Before the judgment of the dead, every deceased person had to let his heart weigh against the feather of the mate. Those who had lied or wronged had their hearts heavier and were devoured by the solita emit. Thus earthly jurisprudence was combined with the idea of divine justice after death. The close connection between religion, state, and law meant that crime in ancient Egypt was understood not only as a social problem, but also as a cosmic problem. A criminal was not simply a perpetrator against a fellow human being, but a disturber of the divine order. This thinking made the reaction to crime particularly intense and often exemplary. Public punishments served to make the values of society visible and to confirm the authority of the pharaoh. At the same time, criminal law was also an instrument of political power. Pharaoh and his officials used it to ensure loyalty and suppress deviation. In this sense, the Egyptian criminal system was not only an expression of religious convictions, but also a means of stabilizing one of the oldest advanced civilizations in the world. The history of crime in ancient Egypt thus shows a culture in which crimes were always seen in connection with the divine order. Punishments were not only for the purpose of retaliation or deterrence, but also served to restore the balance of Maat. Property crimes, grave robbery, violent crimes, and treason were the central crimes that were prosecuted. The sanctions ranged from compensation to cruel executions, but always with the aim of preserving divine order. When we look at ancient Egypt today, we see both strange and familiar elements. The strong religious charge of the law is strange, familiar with the idea that crime is an attack on the community and must be answered with punishment. This mixture is the fascination of Egyptian criminal law, which not only regulated the everyday order, but also emphasized the cosmic dimension of human action. Chapter 4: Mesopotamia and the Codex Hammurabi. The advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia are considered one of the first cradles of civilization, and with them also began the systematic writing of law and punishment. Between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, city-states and empires arose, which depended on complex administration, trade, and agriculture. In such a world, it became increasingly important to formulate rules clearly and to punish violations consistently. The most famous example of this development is the Codex Hammurabi, a body of laws from the 18th century BC, which is still considered a symbol of the beginning of a codified legal system. But before turning to the Codex, it is worth looking at the general background of Mesopotamian law. Written legal records already existed in the early city-states of Sumer, Ur and Akkad, such as the laws of Yornamu or Lipit-Ishtar. These texts show that property, trade, marriage, and personal security were central concerns even then. They suggest that crime was seen as a violation of the social order, the maintenance of which was the responsibility of the rulers. Religion played a major role in this. The laws were considered to be inspired by the gods, and the king was their earthly guardian. Hammurabi, king of Babylon, reigned around 1792 to 1750 BC, took this tradition to a new level. His codex, which was carved on a diorite stele over 2 meters high, contains 282 paragraphs that regulate a wide range of human action, from property issues to commercial disputes to penalties for bodily injury or death. The stele, discovered in Susa in the 20th century, begins with a prologue inscription in which Hammurabi explains that he enacted the laws on behalf of the gods Shamash and Marduk to establish justice and protect the weak. It is already clear here that law and religion were closely intertwined. The special feature of the codex lies not only in its written fixation, but also in its system. It was less a code of law in the modern sense, which prescribes abstract rules for all cases, but rather a collection of precedents. Each paragraph describes a specific situation and specifies what punishment or compensation is provided for it. The most famous principle found in it is that of the talion, i.e. retribution according to the pattern of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. However, this principle does not mean that punishments have always been brutal, but that they should correspond to the offense. The aim was to establish a balance and ensure order. The crimes dealt with in the codex clearly show which values were particularly important to Babylonian society. Property and trade occupied a central place. Since Mesopotamia lived heavily on agriculture and trade routes, theft was a serious threat. Anyone who stole livestock or crops, for example, not only had to return what they had stolen, but was often also severely punished. Temple theft was considered a particularly serious crime because it insulted both the gods and the community. In some cases, theft could even be punished by death, especially if it concerned the state or religious institutions. Family law also played an important role. Adultery, incest, or violation of family duties were strictly regulated. Women had rights that were protected in some cases, such as the right to dowry or to care after divorce. At the same time, however, the Codex also shows the patriarchal structure of society, in which men had the upper hand in many issues. Violence within the family was not always considered a crime, but could be considered legitimate punishment. The provisions on bodily injury are particularly remarkable. Here the talion principle can be found in its classic form. If a man knocked out another man's eye, his own eye had to be knocked out. If he broke a bone, the same bone was broken. But the principle did not apply equally to everyone. The punishment depended on the social rank of the victim. If a member of the upper class was injured, the punishment was harsher than for a slave. This makes it clear that Babylonian law was not based on equality, but on a clear hierarchy in which social differences were also legally secured. Homicides were viewed in a differentiated way in the Codex. Murder could be punished with death, but in some cases material compensation was also possible. If a contractor built an unsafe house that later collapsed and killed the occupants, he was executed, a rule that shows how strongly Babylonian law established responsibilities. The idea of liability expressed in this example seems surprisingly modern. Fraud and corruption were also topics. Traders who used false weights or officials who abused their position were severely sanctioned. The Codex thus shows that even in this early period there was an awareness of the dangers of the abuse of power and economic manipulation. The punishments ranged from cash or non-cash benefits to corporal punishment and the death penalty. Executions could be carried out by drowning, burning, or beheading. Corporal punishment such as flogging or mutilation was widespread. But the idea of reparation also appears again and again. Anyone who caused damage had to compensate for it, often several times over. Criminal law thus served not only as a deterrent, but also as a practical restoration of order. Another important aspect of the Codex Hammurabi is its public accessibility. The stele was set up in such a way that every citizen could see the laws. Even though many people were not able to read, visibility had a symbolic function. It showed that law was not arbitrary, but fixed. This strengthened confidence in Hammurabi's rule and gave the people the feeling that justice was comprehensible and universal, even if in reality it depended heavily on social status. The significance of the Codex Hammurabi extends far beyond Babylon. It influenced later legal systems in Mesopotamia and was received by scholars in the Middle Ages as an example of early legislation. In modern times, it is considered one of the oldest testimonies of written law ever. Its principles, such as the talion principle or the idea of adhesion, can be found in various forms up to the present day. In the history of crime, the Codex Hammurabi marks a turning point. He shows that law cannot only be based on oral tradition, but must also be written down and institutionalized in order to order a complex society. It combines religious legitimacy with pragmatic rules, harsh punishments with reparations, social hierarchy with a claim to universal justice. This makes it a key text that informs us not only about the Babylonian criminal system, but also about the foundations of human concepts of law. Chapter 5: Crime and Law in Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is considered a cradle of European culture, and the understanding of law and crime was also decisively shaped during this era. The Greek polis were the first to develop forms of a bourgeois legal system that was not based exclusively on divine authority, but increasingly on human rationality and discussion. This gave rise to a new relationship between the individual, the community, and the law, which has an impact on the modern tradition of criminal law. In the earliest phases of Greek history, during the so-called Dark Ages after the decline of the Mycenaean culture, norms and punishments were largely determined by clan and tribal structures. Blood feuds and revenge were considered legitimate forms of conflict resolution. Murder or serious bodily injury did not lead to a public trial, but to a private dispute between the families involved. The idea that a crime was a matter for the entire polis developed only later. A decisive step towards state jurisdiction was marked by the legislation of Dracon in Athens in the 7th century BC. Dracon became famous, or notorious, for his extremely severe punishments. He even imposed the death penalty for minor offenses. The term draconian for excessively harsh measures is derived from him to this day. Even if the exact details of his laws are disputed, Dracon symbolizes the transition from oral tradition to written law. His laws made it clear that penalties were no longer to be imposed arbitrarily, but according to fixed rules. Dracon was succeeded in the 6th century BC by Solon, who is considered one of the most important legislators of antiquity. Solon fundamentally reformed Athenian law. He softened the severity of the draconian punishments, abolished debt slavery, and created a fairer system of justice. It was particularly important that he placed the responsibility for legal issues more in the hands of the citizens. Through the people's courts, the so-called hysteria, ordinary citizens could now also have a say in guilt and punishment. This created a first approach to the rule of law and democratic participation. Crime in ancient Greece included a wide range of offenses. Property crimes such as theft or fraud played an important role, as possession and trade became more important in the growing urban life. Murder and assault remained central crimes, but they were increasingly regulated by public trials. It is particularly interesting that a distinction was made between intentional murder, phonos ek pronoias, and manslaughter without intention, phonos acousios. This differentiation, which still plays a role in criminal law today, shows the growing sensitivity to the inner motives of a perpetrator. In addition to the classic violent and property crimes, there were also numerous political and religious offenses in Greece. High treason, conspiracies against the polis, or the violation of religious taboos were severely punished. A famous example is the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. He was accused of corrupting youth and failing to honor the gods. Even though this trial was less a classic criminal trial than a politically motivated verdict, it shows how closely politics, religion, and criminal law were intertwined in Athens. The punishments in ancient Greece varied depending on the severity of the offense. Fines and material compensation were common, especially in the case of property crimes. Corporal punishment such as flogging also occurred, although less frequently than in other cultures. The death penalty could be imposed for serious crimes, in particular murder, treason, or sacrilege. In Athens, this was often carried out through the poisoned cup, as in the case of Socrates. Other forms were stoning or execution by hanging. Banishment was another common punishment that was also a way to prevent blood feuds. The convicted man had to leave the polis and was no longer allowed to approach it, a serious turning point in a society in which belonging to the community was crucial for life. The courts of the polis were not only places of justice, but also scenes of political and social debate. Trials were public events at which speakers, prosecutors, and defense attorneys presented their arguments in front of large audiences. It was not only about the concrete act, but also about questions of morality, civic duty, and loyalty to the polis. Often it is not only the facts that decide, but also the rhetorical persuasiveness. This led to gifted speakers having great influence and processes being a mirror of societal values. Another remarkable aspect is the close connection between law and philosophy. Greek thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle dealt intensively with questions of justice, law, and punishment. In his dialogues, Plato sketched ideal images of states in which laws were not only intended to impose punishments, but also to promote the moral education of citizens. Aristotle distinguished between natural law and positive law, thus laying the foundations that continue to have an impact on the philosophy of law in modern times. The criminal system in ancient Greece was thus more than just a collection of rules. It was part of a larger discourse about the good life, the role of the individual in the community, and the question of justice. Crime was not only seen as individual misconduct, but also as a threat to the community. Therefore, trials and punishments were considered necessary to secure the order of the polis and confirm its values. Even though the Greek legal system has been overtaken in many respects by later developments, it has left lasting traces. The idea that laws should not be arbitrary but rationally justified, the distinction between different types of homicide, the role of public courts, and the combination of law and philosophy, all these are achievements that laid the foundation for later European law. Ancient Greece, for example, shows how a culture of blood revenge and private atonement could give rise to a system of public justice. This system was still imperfect, often permeated by political interests and not free of injustice. But it was a decisive step on the way to a legal system that not only secures power, but also strives for justice. In this field of tension between tradition and innovation, between religion, politics, and philosophy, an understanding of crime and law developed that continues to have an impact today. Chapter 6: Rome and its legal system. Ancient Rome was a society that was characterized by law and order like no other. While religious ideas dominated jurisprudence in many early advanced civilizations, Rome developed a system that was increasingly based on secular principles and was characterized by a legal professionalism that was unique at the time. In this context, crime was not only a moral or religious offense, but a clearly defined offense against the order of the state and its citizens. The Roman legal system, which was constantly developed over the centuries, formed the basis for later European law and continues to shape our ideas of criminal law to this day. In the early days of the Roman Republic in the 5th century BC, the law was still strongly influenced by traditions and the decisions of the patricians. In order to avoid arbitrariness, the famous Law of the 12 Tables was created in 451–450 BC, the first written law of Rome. It was a response to pressure from plebeians demanding more legal certainty and ensured that laws were publicly available. The 12 tables dealt with a variety of topics, including property, inheritance law, contract law, but also penal provisions. It was particularly important that the punishments were clearly defined so that no one was at the mercy of the arbitrary judgment of a powerful person. Roman criminal law differed from many other cultures in one crucial respect. It regarded crimes not only as private matters, but as offenses against the community. While blood feuds still played a role in early Rome, over time the idea came to the fore that the state itself had to exercise the monopoly on the use of force. Murder, robbery, or betrayal were no longer conflicts between two families, but attacks on the order of Rome, which had to be answered by public trials and punishments. Religious offenses also played a role in Roman law, albeit in a different form than in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Sacrilege, i.e. the violation of holy places or the desecration of cult objects, was a serious crime. But while religion in Rome was closely linked to the state, the focus was not on personal piety, but on loyalty to the official cults. According to Roman understanding, anyone who refused to obey the state gods endangered the favor of the gods for the entire community. This explains why early Christians were often persecuted as criminals. Their refusal to recognize the cult of the emperor was not only considered a religious deviation, but an act of subversive of the state. The punishments in Rome ranged from fines to corporal punishment to cruel executions. Especially in the imperial era, public punishments became a spectacle. Crucifixions, burnings, or handing them over to wild animals in the arenas served not only as punishment, but also as deterrence and entertainment. Such cruel practices were an expression of the Roman consciousness of power and were intended to demonstrate that no crime went unpunished. At the same time, there were also milder punishments such as exilium, which was often used against political opponents. A central component of the Roman legal system was the development of a professional court system. Unlike in Greece, where lay judges often decided according to rhetorical arguments, a class of lawyers emerged in Rome who systematically studied and applied the law. Trials took place before magistrates and jury courts, and there were clear rules of procedure. This professionalization led to Roman law achieving a high degree of precision and rationality. The famous distinction between public and private law, which was developed in Roman thought, still exists today. While private law regulated conflicts between individuals, for example in inheritance or contract, public law dealt with offenses against the state and the community. Crime was thus clearly anchored in the area of public law, a step that paved the way for the modern idea of the state as the bearer of the monopoly on the use of force. The principle of proportionality also played a role in Roman law. Although the penalties were often harsh, a precise distinction was made between different types of offenses. The intention of the perpetrator, the severity of the crime, and the social circumstances were taken into account. Thus, a murder in self-defense could be treated differently from an insidious assassination. This differentiated view was a significant development compared to the rather rigid penal systems of earlier cultures. Roman law had an impact far beyond antiquity. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it was preserved in many regions as leges Romani and shaped the legal traditions of Europe. In the Middle Ages, Roman law was rediscovered and systematically studied at universities such as Bologna. To this day, it forms the basis of many modern legal systems, especially in continental Europe. Terms such as crimen, lex, ius, or poena can be found in numerous legal traditions. Crime in ancient Rome was therefore not only a social problem, but a reflection of the balance of power. Criminal law served both order and political stability. It protected property, trade, and public safety, but also the authority of the state and the emperor. Punishments were often cruel, but they followed clear rules and were part of a rationally thought-out system. When we look at Rome today, we see in it both the harshness of an ancient society and the astonishing modernity of many of its legal principles. The idea that crimes must be prosecuted in public, that punishment should be proportionate, and that trials should follow fixed rules is a legacy of Roman law. It is in this mixture of violence, rationality, and political expediency that the special significance of the Roman legal system in the history of crime lies. Chapter 7. Crime in the Early Middle Ages. The Early Middle Ages, which date from about the 5th to the 10th century, were an era of profound upheavals. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the centralized structures that had shaped law and law enforcement for centuries disappeared in many places. They were replaced by new political entities, tribal kingdoms, and royal dominions that developed their own forms of law and order. Crime during this period was very different from the ideas of antiquity. It was not primarily seen as an attack on the state, but as a violation of honor, peace, or order within a community. The legal conception in the early Middle Ages was strongly influenced by personality. Roman law, which had emphasized public order, was replaced by a legal practice based on kinship, clan, and personal ties. If someone committed murder or theft, it was not understood as an offense against an abstract institution such as the state, but as a violation of the rights and honor of a family. The task of responding to this injustice therefore lay primarily with the victim's relatives. As a result, blood feuds and feuds played a central role in the early Middle Ages. Blood revenge was not an uncontrolled act of retaliation, but a socially accepted means of restoring justice. Anyone who lost a relative was obliged to take revenge in order to preserve the honor of the family. If he failed to do so, he was considered weak and lost reputation. But at the same time, blood feuds were also a source of endless conflict, as they could lead to chains of violence. In order to curb this spiral, compensation mechanisms developed early on. This is where the Wergeld appeared, a fixed sum that the perpetrator or his family had to pay to the victim's family. The Wergeld was a central element of early medieval legal practice. It varied depending on the social rank of the victim and reflected the hierarchical structure of society. The death of a free man was valued more highly than that of a slave, and the death of a nobleman could require enormous sums of money. This graduation made it clear that life was not considered equal, but graded according to rank and status. At the same time, the Wergeld was a means of curbing violence and securing social peace. It made it possible to make materially measurable reparations instead of blood revenge. In addition to murder and assault, property crimes played a major role in the early Middle Ages. Cattle theft, robbery, and arson were among the most common offenses. Since property was the basis of survival in an agrarian society, any threat to property was considered a serious crime. Here, too, the Wergeld could serve as compensation, but in some cases thieves were punished particularly harshly. Sources report mutilations such as cutting off the hand or even executions to deter others. The legal sources of the early Middle Ages show a fascinating mixture of Roman heritage, Germanic traditions, and Christian influences. The people's rights of the Germanic tribes, such as the Lex Salica of the Franks or the Lex Alamanorum, contain numerous provisions on punishments and compensation. They were mostly written down in Latin, but remained strongly influenced by oral tradition. The Lex Salica, for example, lists in detail the sums that had to be paid as Wergeld for certain injuries or killings. It is an impressive document that shows how differentiated the ideas of crime and reparation already were. With the Christianization of Europe, new elements were added. The Church brought not only moral standards, but also its own punitive practices. Sin and crime were often mentioned in the same breath, and confession became a means of atoning for criminal behavior as well. Church punishments such as penances, fasting, or pilgrimages supplemented secular sanctions. In some cases, the Church even took on the role of an arbitrator, thus contributing to the pacification of conflicts. The idea of divine justice reinforced the feeling that criminality concerned not only the community but also the relationship of the individual to God. Another special feature of the early Middle Ages were the so-called divine judgments. In a world where evidence and systematic investigation were scarce, religious trials were often used to determine guilt or innocence. For example, the defendant had to carry a red-hot iron or dip his hand in boiling water. If the wounds healed after a few days, this was considered a sign of divine innocence, otherwise a proof of guilt. The so-called dual procedure was also a judgment of God. It was assumed that God would give victory to the righteous. These practices seem irrational from today's perspective, but they were an expression of a deep belief in divine order in an uncertain world. Crime in the early Middle Ages also had a political dimension. Rulers such as the Frankish kings or later Charlemagne tried to place law and order more in the hands of the monarchy. They issued capitularies that punished certain offenses particularly severely in order to consolidate their authority. High treason or rebellion against the king was considered the most serious crime, which was usually punishable by death. Breaking the oath of allegiance, the basis of the feudal system, was also a capital crime. This shows that crime did not only include individual offenses, but was also understood as an attack on the political order. Despite these developments, the early Middle Ages remained a time in which law and law enforcement were organized locally, personally, and often confusingly. There was no unified police force or centralized courts. Instead, the prosecution was based on the initiative of the victim's family, the authority of local lords, or the mediation of the church. Trials often took place in the open air, in front of the congregation or the thing, a gathering of free men. The public was a decisive element in this. It ensured the legitimacy of the decision and made the punishment visible. If we look at the criminal system of the early Middle Ages today, we recognize a transitional period. On the one hand, there were archaic practices such as blood revenge, divine judgments, and cruel punishments, and on the other hand, the beginnings of a regulated legal system with Wergeld, people's rights, and church penance. This mixture made the early Middle Ages an epoch in which old and new forms coexisted. Crime was ubiquitous, but it was regulated in ways that were intended to curb violence and preserve the honor of those involved. The early Middle Ages show that crime in a society without a strong central state did not simply mean chaos. There were functioning mechanisms of conflict resolution, even if they seem foreign to us today. The history of crime in this epoch is therefore not only a history of violence and insecurity, but also one of adaptation, innovation, and the slow path towards a stronger institutionalization of law, which was to become more visible in the High Middle Ages. Chapter 8. High and Late Middle Ages. The High and Late Middle Ages, which roughly range from the 11th to the 15th century, were a time of far-reaching changes in politics, society, and the economy, which also had a lasting impact on the criminal system. While the early Middle Ages were still strongly determined by local structures, blood feuds, and Wergeld, new forms of state and municipal jurisdiction now developed. Kingdoms, principalities, and, above all, the growing cities began to create uniform orders in which crime was increasingly understood as a public offense. The relationship between the individual and the community shifted, and with it the definition and punishment of crimes. Urbanization was a major factor. With the rise of the cities as centers of trade and crafts, not only prosperity grew, but also crime. The close proximity of many people, the clash of different groups, and the concentration of goods created new incentives for theft, fraud, or robbery. Cities reacted to this by developing their own legal systems, the city or city rights, which stipulated which offenses were to be punished and how. These codifications led to a greater standardization of criminal law and created more legal certainty than in the fragmented structures of the early Middle Ages. The Wergeld system, which had previously been a central instrument of conflict resolution, increasingly lost its importance in the High and Late Middle Ages. Instead, the idea came to the fore that a crime could not be regulated by compensation alone, but that it was an attack on the order of the community that the authorities had to punish. This strengthened the role of rulers, cities, and courts as guardians of the law. Punishments became less private and more public, and they were intended not only to compensate the victim but also to protect the community from further offenses. The offenses that were prosecuted during this time were diverse. Property crimes such as theft and robbery were in the first place, but assault, manslaughter, and murder also played a major role. In addition, there were specific offenses associated with the city's economy, such as fraud in trade, counterfeiting, or the dilution of beer and wine. Since markets and guilds were of central importance, any attack on the honesty of trade was considered a serious crime. Particularly formative for the High and Late Middle Ages, however, were offenses that we would today call sins against religion. Heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft gained prominence as criminal categories. The Church, which had enormous power at that time, saw the deviation from the faith not only as a threat to the souls of the faithful, but also to the entire social order. This led to the emergence of the Inquisition, which was institutionalized by Pope Innocent III in the 13th century to combat heresy. Trials against heretics, who often forced confessions through torture, often ended with execution at the stake. In this way, religious and secular structures merged in the fight against deviant behavior. The punishments of the High and Late Middle Ages were often spectacular and cruel. While fines and banishments continued to occur, public executions became increasingly important. They served not only to punish the perpetrator, but also to deter and symbolically restore order. Gallows, pyres, and wheels became visible signs of state power. Mutilation punishments such as cutting off hands or ears were also common and were intended to permanently mark the perpetrator as a criminal. The public played a central role in this. Punishments were carried out in market squares, with great participation from the population. Criminal law thus became a spectacle that staged the power of the authorities and reminded the community of the norms that applied. Another important development was the professionalization of the courts. Whereas in the early Middle Ages justice had often been pronounced in popular assemblies, specialized judges, lay judges, and notaries now appeared. The rules of procedure became more precise, even though torture remained common as a means of establishing the truth. The idea that confessions were the queen of evidence led to defendants being confessed guilty in the most severe agony. This practice shows the ambivalence of medieval criminal law. On the one hand, it strove for order and justice. On the other hand, it used methods that seem cruel and unjust from today's perspective. In the High and Late Middle Ages, the role of the feud deserves special attention. Even though state structures became stronger, the feud remained as a form of private conflict resolution. Noble and powerful families waged bloody conflicts, which often destabilized entire regions. In order to curb this violence, the Church tried to exempt at least certain times and places from feuds with the true Dei, the peace of God. The state also intervened in a regulatory manner by trying to restrict the right to feud and replace it with public court proceedings. Nevertheless, the feud remained an integral part of social life until the late Middle Ages. A striking example of medieval crime is the figure of the robber baron. These nobles, who turned their backs on the king or cities and instead organized raids on their own, became symbols of lawlessness. They attacked merchants, plundered villages, and disregarded the law. Cities and princes reacted with military force and the destruction of the castles of such knights. The fight against the robber barons was not only a punitive measure, but also a step towards strengthening central power and enforcing an orderly legal order. The role of women in the criminal system of the High and Late Middle Ages is also important. Women could be victims as well as perpetrators, but their offenses were often judged with particular severity. Suspicions of witchcraft mainly affected women, and they easily became the target of the Inquisition. At the same time, sources show that women were also persecuted as perpetrators of theft, adultery, or poisoning. The punishments reflected the patriarchal worldview, in which women were more strongly suspected of being weak, seductive, or dangerous. The High and Late Middle Ages were an epoch in which crime and justice became central social issues. The emergence of cities, the growing importance of trade, and the strengthening of power structures led to the fact that crimes were no longer understood only as private injustice, but increasingly as an attack on public order. The punishments became harsher, more public, and more symbolic, and the Church made a decisive contribution to the criminalization of certain behaviors with its trials of heretics and witches. When we look back on this era today, we see a time in which crime moved between tradition and modernity. The elements of the early Middle Ages, feud, blood feud, and Wergeld, were still present, but at the same time structures emerged that pointed to a state-controlled legal system. This development prepared the ground for the modern era, in which criminal law, police, and courts were institutionalized in a previously unknown way. The High and Late Middle Ages were thus a transitional period in which crime was more visible and spectacular than ever, and at the same time the foundation stone for modern legal systems was laid. Chapter 9. Robbers, Gangs, and Pirates. Crime in the High and Late Middle Ages was not limited to urban offenses such as theft, fraud, or assault. A particularly visible and often feared area was organized violence, which came from robbers, gangs, and pirates. These manifestations are not a marginal phenomenon, but an integral part of everyday life in the Middle Ages and at the same time a mirror of the political, economic, and social tensions of the time. They show how difficult it was for the emerging states and cities to enforce a monopoly on the use of force and how crime could shape entire regions. Robbers were already considered a serious threat in the early Middle Ages, but their influence increased in the High and Late Middle Ages. On trade routes that meandered through forests and confusing terrain, highwaymen lurked and attacked merchants and travelers. As long-distance trade grew and cities increasingly exchanged goods, robbers were offered rich booty. Salt, cloth, and precious metals were particularly valuable. The dangers of trade journeys are described in numerous chronicles, and merchants often had to travel armed or join together in caravans to protect themselves against raids. Many predators were not isolated loners, but part of larger gangs that operated over extended periods of time. These groups had leaders who were strategic, and they often had local networks to shelter them. It was not uncommon for them to work together with peasants or even lower nobles, who profited from the raids or offered protection. In some regions, the line between robbery and legitimate feud was blurred. A nobleman who attacked an enemy merchant train could present this as part of a feud, while from the victim's point of view he was simply a robber. A special figure in this context is the so-called robber baron. Many smaller nobles, who were in need due to the economic changes of the late Middle Ages, turned to robbery. They used their castles as starting points for raids on merchants, villages, or rival lordships. In the eyes of the cities and princes, they were outlaws, but they often saw themselves as legitimate lords who enforced their rights by force. The battles against the robber barons, which intensified in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially in Germany, show how closely crime, politics, and social tensions were connected. It was only when cities and sovereigns strengthened their power that many of these castles were destroyed and the robber barons subdued. Gangs also played a role in the urban environment. In large cities such as Paris, London, or Cologne, groups of criminals formed who jointly organized thefts, burglaries, or robberies. These gangs were often rooted in the poorer classes, where poverty, hunger, and lack of prospects promoted crime. Some gangs specialize in certain crimes, such as pickpocketing at markets or breaking into warehouses. Others tied themselves to local innkeepers who bought stolen goods or offered hiding places. This created a kind of criminal milieu, which is often associated with dark neighborhoods and shady characters in the sources. The authorities reacted with a hard hand. Robbers and gang members were often executed if they were caught, often by particularly drastic punishments such as hanging from the gallows or wheels. This harshness not only had the function of deterrence, but also a symbolic meaning. The fight against robbers was a struggle to assert state authority. But despite all efforts, the problem persisted for centuries. This shows that crime in medieval Europe was not simply the exception, but a permanent reality. Even more dangerous and far-reaching than bands of robbers were the pirates who made the sea routes unsafe. At a time when trade across the Mediterranean, the North Sea and the Baltic Sea was flourishing, pirates were a constant threat. In the Mediterranean, various groups of pirates have continued their raids since ancient times, often supported by local rulers who profited from the booty. Especially in the late Middle Ages, Muslim corsairs from North Africa played a major role, attacking coastal cities, hijacking ships, and enslaving people. For Christian traders and pilgrims, the crossing to the Holy Land was often associated with the fear of falling into the hands of such pirates. In northern Europe, the Witte brothers made a name for themselves in the 14th century. Originally used as mercenaries in the service of the Hanseatic League, they soon took on a life of their own and became feared pirates who operated from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. Its best-known leader, Klaus Stortbeker, became a legend, not least because of his spectacular execution in Hamburg. The Witte brothers show how thin the line was between legitimate warfare and criminal piracy. Often such groups depended on political conflicts and easily found allies in troubled times. Piracy was not only a criminal problem, but also a political one. Powers such as England, France, or Spain used buccaneers, i.e. officially tolerated pirates, to weaken their opponents. This practice of letters of capture led to piracy often being legalized as long as it was in the interest of one's own crown. But from the victim's point of view, the difference between a buccaneer and a pirate was small. Both attacked ships, robbed goods, and put human lives at risk. The reaction to robbers, gangs, and pirates was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were persecuted with extreme severity, and on the other hand, they were sometimes romanticized. Folk songs, chronicles, and legends often portray robbers and pirates as heroes of the poor, who plundered the rich and shared property with the needy. It is difficult to say whether these stories have a true core, but they show that crime also had a symbolic dimension. It was an expression of social inequality and power conflicts that directly affected many people. In retrospect, it can be said that robbers, gangs, and pirates were not just a marginal phenomenon in the High and Late Middle Ages, but central elements of the criminal system. They made it clear how unsafe roads and seas remained despite all the efforts of the authorities. At the same time, they were a mirror of social upheavals. Poverty, political instability, and weak state structures provided them with fertile ground. It was only with the increasing consolidation of the states in the early modern period that it was possible to get a better grip on this problem. Nevertheless, the fascination remains. Characters such as Stortbeker or the robber barons are still part of popular culture today, in songs, novels, or films. They remind us that crime was perceived not only as a threat, but also as a rebellious alternative to the prevailing order. In the Middle Ages, however, they were one thing above all: a real danger to life, trade, and the stability of society. Chapter 10: Early Modern Times. The early modern period, which spans from about the 16th to the 18th century, was an epoch of profound upheavals in Europe. Discoveries of new continents, the Reformation, the formation of early modern states, and finally the Enlightenment shaped people's thoughts and actions. The criminal system also underwent fundamental changes during this time. While medieval ideas of law and punishment continued to have an effect, new structures developed at the same time that paved the way for modern criminal law. Crime remained a central issue, but the way it was defined, prosecuted, and punished changed significantly. A striking feature of the early modern period was the increasing centralization of state power. The formation of absolutist rulers in France, Spain, or Prussia led to the fact that jurisdiction was placed more in the hands of the state. While in the Middle Ages local courts, nobles, or municipal authorities had played a major role, now kings and princes claimed supreme authority over law and punishment. This development strengthened the state's monopoly on the use of force and led to the standardization of penal codes. In France, for example, royal courts were established that punished offenses centrally, and in Prussia, under Frederick the Great, a systematic codification of the law was sought. Despite these approaches, the criminal law of the early modern period was still characterized by great harshness. Crimes were understood not only as an attack on individuals, but as a threat to society as a whole. Therefore, penalties must be exemplary, visible, and deterrent. Public executions were an integral part of everyday life and were attended by large crowds. Gallows, wheels, and pyres shaped the towns and villages. The death penalty was imposed for a variety of offenses, not only for murder or high treason, but also for property crimes such as aggravated theft or arson. The criminalization of heresy and witchcraft played a central role in the early modern period. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation led to bitter religious conflicts, in which deviation from the true faith was understood as a threat to the salvation of the community. Witch trials took on unimagined proportions in the 16th and 17th centuries, with women and men accused of witchcraft being caught up in a judicial system that was characterized by denunciation, extortion of confessions, and torture. The idea that witches had allied themselves with the devil and could cause harm through magic was associated with social tensions, economic hardship, and religious fanaticism. Witch trials were not only legal events, but also social events. They served to channel the fears of the population and to confirm the authority of church and state. Executions at the stake were not only intended to punish the perpetrators, but also to purify the community. In some regions of Europe, such as southern Germany or Switzerland, witch hunts led to hundreds of victims. It was not until the end of the 17th century that skepticism slowly prevailed that witchcraft was a product of superstition and fear, and the trials declined. In addition to witchcraft, political offences were also of central importance. High treason, lèse majesty, or rebellions against the authorities were considered the most serious crimes. In a time when princes often understood their power absolutely, any attack on their authority was considered an attack on the divine order. Trials against political opponents were therefore often staged to force obedience. Public display of punishment was a means of making power visible. But everyday crime also played a major role in the early modern period. The growing mobility of people led to new problems. Vagabonds, beggars, and roving gangs were considered a threat to public order. The term poor crime arose because poverty and crime were closely linked. Many authorities responded with repressive measures by expelling vagrants from the cities, setting up work institutions, or imposing harsh punishments on beggars. This practice shows how much crime was defined not only legally, but also socially. The rise of trade gave rise to new forms of crime. Smuggling, counterfeiting, forgery of documents, or fraud in international trade became offenses that threatened the growing economic systems. States responded with specialized jurisdiction and created institutions to prosecute these offenses. The training of police in the modern sense began during this time. In France, for example, Louis XIV founded a police prefecture in Paris that was responsible for security, order, and the fight against crime. Torture played a central role in criminal law in the early modern period. It was considered a legitimate means of forcing confessions, as it was assumed that truth would only come to light under duress. Defendants were harnessed to the stretching bench, tortured with thumbscrews, or subjected to other tortures until they admitted their guilt. The confession was considered the queen of evidence, and without it a conviction was often difficult to achieve. It was not until the 18th century that jurists and philosophers such as César Beccaria began to fundamentally question the legitimacy of torture. Another important aspect of the early modern period was the increasing professionalization of jurisprudence. While lay courts dominated in the Middle Ages, trained lawyers who had been trained at universities now appeared. This professionalization led to a more systematic application of the law and to a stronger orientation towards codifications fixed in writing. At the same time, the gap between the legal world of scholars and popular belief, which was still strongly influenced by superstition and divine judgments, grew. Despite the harshness and cruelty of many punishments, the early modern period was also a time in which the first attempts to humanize criminal law became visible. With the Enlightenment, the idea spread that punishment should not be arbitrary, but rational and expedient. Philosophers such as John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau discussed the foundations of law and society. César Beccaria's work on Crimes and Punishments, 1764, denounced the cruelty of the death penalty and the senselessness of torture. He called for a criminal law based on deterrence, not revenge, and whose punishments were proportionate. These ideas resonated throughout Europe and influenced reforms in the 18th century. In summary, it can be said that the early modern period was an epoch of contrasts. On the one hand, brutal punishments, witch trials, and torture prevailed. On the other hand, the first modern institutions such as the police, professional courts, and systematic codifications developed. Crime was omnipresent, from poverty crime to political resistance to religious deviation. The reaction to this fluctuated between harsh repression and the first attempts at a more rational order. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the early modern period laid the foundation for modern criminal law. The concentration on the state as the guardian of order, the professionalization of the courts, and the beginnings of police work were developments that continue to have an impact today. At the same time, this epoch was a cautionary example of how easily justice and punishment can be put at the service of fear, superstition, and political power. Chapter 11: Enlightenment and Criminal Law Reforms. The Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century not only brought forth new ideas about politics, society, and science, but also led to a profound change in the understanding of crime and punishment. While the early modern period had been characterized by draconian punishments, public executions, witch trials, and the systematic use of torture, a new attitude based on reason, proportionality, and humanity now prevailed. Philosophers, lawyers, and reformist politicians questioned traditional practices and laid the foundations for modern criminal law, as it applies today in large parts of the world. The central concern of the Enlightenment was the liberation of man from immaturity and superstition. Reason was to take the place of tradition, dogma, and arbitrariness. This also applied to criminal law. Until well into the 18th century, even minor offenses were punished with cruel corporal punishment or death. Executions were public spectacles, torture was a legitimate means of establishing the truth, and punishment served less for justice than for a demonstration of power. Enlightenment thinkers realized that these practices were not only inhumane, but also ineffective. They created fear and oppression, but did not create a more just society. One of the most important representatives of this new view was César Beccaria. With his work Dei delitti e del pene, on crimes and punishments, of 1764, he published one of the most influential writings in legal history. Beccaria criticized the brutality of the existing criminal law and argued that punishment should not be based on revenge or cruelty, but solely on the benefit to society. The aim of the punishment is to prevent future crimes, not to torture the perpetrator. Therefore, punishment must be fast, safe and proportionate, but not cruel. Beccaria was particularly clear in his opposition to the death penalty. He did not see it as a deterrent benefit, but as a form of state arbitrariness that violated the right to life. He also rejected torture, which he exposed as unreasonable and unjust. It does not punish guilt, but the physical strength or weakness of the accused. His ideas attracted attention throughout Europe and triggered debates that still reverberate today. But Beccaria was not the only one to rethink criminal law. Montesquieu had already emphasized in his work on the spirit of the laws, 1748, that law should correspond to nature and reason. He pleaded for the separation of powers and saw arbitrary rule as the greatest threat to freedom and justice. Voltaire also fought against judicial arbitrariness and for the humanization of the law in numerous writings. The famous case of Collars, in which an innocent Protestant was executed for murder, became a symbol of the need for legal reforms through Voltaire's commitment. In Germany, thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and later Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel took up the discussion. Kant emphasized that punishment is a moral necessity because it corresponds to the principle of justice. For him, it was unthinkable that a murderer should go unpunished, even if society had no practical benefit from it. Hegel saw punishment as the abolition of injustice and as the restoration of freedom. Even if their argumentation deviated from Beccaria's utilitarian approach, they contributed to the theoretical foundation of modern criminal law. Parallel to these theoretical debates, the first concrete reforms began. In Austria, Joseph II carried out one of the first major criminal law reforms in 1787. He abolished torture and largely abolished the death penalty by introducing long-term forced labor and imprisonment instead. There were also changes in other countries. In Prussia, the general land law was created in 1794, which systematized punishments and oriented them more closely to principles of proportionality. France underwent a radical reorganization during the Revolution of 1789. The old feudal system was abolished, new penal laws were introduced, and the principle of equality before the law was enshrined. Another important field was the development of the prison system. While punishments in the Middle Ages and the early modern period had consisted mainly of corporal punishment, executions, or fines, the idea now arose to punish and improve criminals by deprivation of liberty. Prisons were no longer used only as places of custody until execution, but as actual penal institutions. In England and the USA in particular, new models were experimented with, such as solitary confinement or compulsory work, which were intended to morally educate and resocialize the offender. Even though these approaches often failed or created new problems, they marked an important step towards modern penal systems. The Enlightenment also brought a new understanding of crime itself. Whereas crimes had previously often been seen as an expression of malice, the influence of the devil or sinful nature, social causes were now increasingly recognized. Poverty, inequality, or lack of education were considered factors that could promote crime. Although this insight did not immediately lead to comprehensive social reforms, it did lay the foundation for later approaches to the sociology of crime. The shift in the relationship between state and citizen is also remarkable. The Enlightenment emphasized the rights of the individual, and this was also true in criminal law. The defendant was no longer regarded as an object without rights, but as a human being with dignity and rights. Fair trials, the right to defense and protection against arbitrariness were increasingly demanded. In many countries, the first beginnings of the rule of law emerged, enshrining the principle of nulla poena sine lege, no punishment without law. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the Enlightenment brought about a fundamental paradigm shift in the criminal system. It replaced the logic of fear with the logic of reason, arbitrariness with codification, cruelty with proportionality. Of course, much remained imperfect, and practice often lagged behind ideals. Public executions did not disappear immediately, and the death penalty remained in many places. But the direction was set: punishment should no longer be revenge, but a rational measure in the interest of society. The Enlightenment and the criminal law reforms of the 18th century thus paved the way for the 19th century, in which criminology emerged as a science and the institutions of modern criminal justice took shape. They mark a decisive step on the long road from archaic practices to a more humane, rational, and just jurisprudence. Chapter 12: The Emergence of Modern Police. With the transition from the 18th to the 19th century, the understanding of crime and how to combat it changed fundamentally. Whereas previously, local courts, city guards, or military forces had ensured order, an institution emerged that we now take for granted: the modern police. It was not only an instrument of law enforcement, but also an expression of a new concept of order in which the state claimed a monopoly on security. This development was closely linked to urbanization, industrialization, and the growth of modern nation-states, which required control and organization in a way that had never been seen before. There had already been various forms of security organs in the early modern period. City guards, night watchmen, and so-called buttle-monitored markets, streets and squares. In rural areas, village communities with lay judges and jurisdictions ensured order, while in larger cities council courts and municipal security services operated. However, these structures were localized, uncoordinated, and often inefficient. In addition, they were often under the control of local elites, so that they protected their interests rather than the general public. In the 18th century, countries such as France and Austria began to develop more systematic forms of policing. In Paris, a police prefecture was founded in 1667, which was responsible not only for fighting crime, but also for firefighting, hygiene, and market supervision. The word police itself had a much broader meaning then than it does today. It stood for order and administration in the comprehensive sense. The police were an instrument of state governance that was supposed to regulate everything that concerned the good state of society. This early form of police was therefore much more than a security apparatus. It was part of the administrative power of absolutist rulers. However, the actual birth of the modern police in the narrower sense struck in England. In London, the rapid growth of the population in the 18th century led to considerable security problems. Street crime, theft, and gang warfare increased, and the previous security services were overwhelmed. The decisive step came in 1829 with the establishment of the Metropolitan Police by Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel. This institution was new in several respects. It was centrally organized, professionally trained and financed, uniformed and entrusted with clearly defined tasks. The officers, soon known as bobbies or peelers, were not only supposed to solve crimes, but above all to prevent crimes through presence and patrols. The London Metropolitan Police model soon became a model for many other countries. It combined two elements that still shape the understanding of the police today: prevention and enforcement. The policeman was not only someone who intervened after a crime, but someone who was visible on the streets, gave the population security and prevented crime through surveillance and control. This idea that the police are part of the public space and have a regulating effect there was new and formative. Reforms also took place on the European continent in the 19th century. In France, a modern police system was established after the Revolution, which was highly centralized and remained closely linked to political power. The French police were not only responsible for crime, but also an instrument of political surveillance. Opposition members, journalists, and dissidents quickly became the target of the authorities. This shows an ambivalence that accompanied the police from the very beginning. On the one hand, they were a guarantor of security, and on the other hand, a tool of state control and oppression. In Germany, police structures initially developed at the level of the individual states. Prussia, for example, set up a police force in the 19th century that was responsible for both crime and order in public spaces. It monitored markets, factories, and assemblies and was thus an important instrument of the emerging authoritarian state. Especially in times of political unrest, such as during the Revolution of 1848, it became apparent that the police not only fought crime, but were also used as a bulwark against social movements. Industrialization increased the need for police forces considerably. Cities grew explosively, factories drew workers to urban centers, poverty and social tensions increased. In this environment, new forms of crime emerged: burglaries, pickpocketing, gangs, and violent clashes in the slums. The police became an indispensable institution for maintaining order in the cities. At the same time, it was often directed against the poor themselves, who were stigmatized as dangerous classes. The close connection between the fight against crime and social control is one of the most striking features of this era. The 19th century also marked the beginning of the professionalization of the criminal police. While the uniformed police were primarily responsible for presence and order, a specialized department for solving crimes was created at the same time. The first criminalists collected information about perpetrators, created files, and developed methods to convict serial offenders. The idea that crime could be systematically investigated soon led to new scientific approaches, which later led to criminology. Another important step was the introduction of police statistics. States began to record crime and document it in figures. This was not only a means of control, but also an expression of a new scientific approach. Crime was no longer to be understood as an isolated case, but as a social phenomenon that could be analyzed and regulated. This was associated with the idea that the police not only react, but are part of a comprehensive administration of society. Despite these advances, the police remained controversial in the 19th century. Many citizens saw it as an instrument of oppression, especially in countries where it was closely linked to political regimes. In England, acceptance was higher because the police were deliberately designed as a civilian institution, without a military presence and with an emphasis on proximity to the population. In continental Europe, on the other hand, the police often appeared authoritarian, which caused mistrust. This tension between security and freedom, between protection and control, accompanies the police to this day. The police of the 19th century laid the foundation for many structures that still exist today: uniformed presence on the streets, specialized criminal police, central file management, systematic statistics. But at the same time, it remains an ambivalent legacy, because from the beginning it was also an instrument of power that targeted not only criminals, but also political opponents and social outsiders. Chapter 13. Crime in the 19th Century. The 19th century was an era of upheaval, marked by industrialization, urbanization, and social change like no other before. These far-reaching changes left clear traces in the criminal system. New forms of crime emerged, old crimes increased in intensity, and society developed a new awareness of crime as a social problem. The development of the police, the judiciary, and science led to crime being recorded and prosecuted more systematically than ever before. At the same time, the 19th century was marked by contradictions. Between progress and misery, humanization of the law and harsh repression, civil security and proletarian hardship. Industrialization was one of the decisive drivers for the change in crime. Millions of people moved from the countryside to the cities to find work in factories. Cities grew explosively, and with them arose new social problems. Slums, overcrowding, miserable hygienic conditions, and unemployment created an environment in which crime could thrive. Property crimes increased sharply, especially burglaries, pickpocketing, and robberies. Many of these crimes were an expression of sheer necessity, because hunger and poverty drove people into crime. At the same time, criminal milieux developed in the urban centers, characterized by gangs and organized structures. The emergence of criminology as a science played a special role. Researchers such as Cesare Lombroso developed theories that interpreted crime as a biologically determined predisposition. Lombroso was convinced that born criminals were recognizable by physical features such as skull or face shapes. Even if his approaches seem outdated and problematic from today's perspective, they mark the beginning of a systematic investigation of crime. Others, such as Enrico Ferri or Raffaele Garofalo, saw social circumstances or psychological factors as the causes of crime. This discussion led to a new perspective. Crime was no longer just a moral failure, but could be scientifically explained and possibly prevented. The second half of the 19th century was not only a time of growing police apparatuses, new criminal laws, and the institutionalization of prisons, but also the birth of a new science, criminology. Whereas crime had previously been interpreted primarily in moral, legal, or religious terms, an attempt was now made to explain it systematically, empirically, and scientifically. The aim was not only to impose punishments, but to understand why people commit crimes, what social, biological, or psychological factors play a role, and how crime could be prevented. The emergence of criminology was closely linked to the general rise of the natural and social sciences. The 19th century was an era of positivism, i.e., the belief that all human behavior can be explained by observation, statistics, and empirical research. Inspired by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and new findings in medicine and anthropology, scientists began to look at crime in this light. Crime no longer appeared only as a free choice or as a sin, but as a phenomenon that could be rooted in the natural laws of man or in the structures of society. A key figure in this development was the Italian physician and anthropologist Cesare Lombroso. With his work L'uomo delinquent, The Criminal Man, from 1876, he founded the so-called school of criminal anthropology. Lombroso argued that there are born criminals who differ from other people by biological characteristics. He interpreted skull and face shapes, body proportions, even tattoos as signs of congenital criminality. According to Lombroso, the criminal is an atavism, i.e., a return to primitive stages of development of humanity. This theory was highly controversial, but it exerted enormous influence. For the first time, crime was not only considered morally or legally, but scientifically. Lombroso's idea that criminals could be recognized fit into a time that was strongly influenced by the search for order and classification. His students and successors such as Enrico Ferri and Raffaele Garofalo expanded the approach. Ferri placed greater emphasis on social factors such as poverty, education, or the environment, while Garofalo tried to define crime in legal and moral philosophical terms. Together, they founded the positive school of criminology, which understood crimes as a result of biological, psychological, and social causes. At the same time, the classical school of criminology, which had its roots in the 18th century with Beccaria and Bentham, continued to develop. Representatives of this direction emphasized that crime is the result of rational decisions. People act according to the principle of benefit and weigh up advantages and risks. That is why criminal law must be designed in such a way that crime becomes unattractive, not through cruelty, but through safe, fast, and proportionate punishments. This approach laid the foundation for modern theories of deterrence and prevention. The tension between the positive and the classical school shaped criminology in the 19th and early 20th centuries. While one side relied on determinism and causal research, the other insisted on responsibility and free will. Both approaches influenced practice. The biological view led to prisons becoming not only places of punishment but also places of observation. Doctors and psychologists examined prisoners, prepared expert reports, and tried to create typologies of criminals. At the same time, the idea prevailed that punishment must be calculable in order to effectively curb crime. However, criminology in the 19th century was not free of problematic tendencies. The search for biological causes often led to discriminatory and racist theories. Minorities, the poor or deviant groups, were easily declared scapegoats. The idea that certain people were criminals by nature often served to legitimize social inequality and state repression. Thus, crime was sometimes seen more as a problem of the others, the poor, the foreigners, the marginalized groups, while structural causes such as exploitation or social injustice receded into the background. Despite these dark sides, the emergence of criminology marked a turning point. For the first time, crime was systematically recorded and statistically examined. States began to publish crime statistics on a regular basis, and scientists analyzed trends and patterns. It was recognized that crime was not evenly distributed, but affected certain groups and regions more strongly. These insights led to debates about how to intervene preventively, for example through education, social reforms, or better housing conditions. Psychology also found its way into criminology. In the late 19th century, researchers began to investigate the psychological causes of crime. Pathological personalities, mental illnesses, or deviant urges were discussed as possible explanations. This opened up the field for a connection between criminology and psychiatry, which was to become even more important in the 20th century. The institutions also reacted to the new scientific findings. Prisons developed into places of observation, classification, and treatment. A distinction was made between criminals who were capable of improvement and incorrigible criminals, and the punishments were adjusted accordingly. These differentiations were an expression of the new view that crime was not uniform, but had different causes and types. Criminology spread rapidly throughout Europe and North America. Universities established chairs, journals were founded, congresses were organized. Crime became a subject of research that occupied not only lawyers and police officers, but also doctors, psychologists, sociologists, and statisticians. The discipline became increasingly important and influenced politics. Laws, penal systems, and policing have been reformed using scientific evidence. In retrospect, it can be said that the emergence of criminology has left an ambivalent legacy. On the one hand, it contributed to a more differentiated understanding of crime, to analyzing causes and initiating humane reforms. It promoted the abolition of torture, the development of juvenile justice, and the idea of resocialization. On the other hand, it was permeated by problematic theories that explained criminality with alleged biological defects or racial characteristics and thus reinforced discrimination. Nevertheless, it remains to be said that criminology was a science that still shapes our understanding of crime today. It turned the criminal not only into a perpetrator in court, but also into an object of research whose behavior could be explained, classified, and possibly changed. This shift was the real breakthrough. Crime was no longer just a moral failure, but a social and scientific phenomenon. Chapter 15. The 20th Century I. Crime in Times of War, Crisis, and Dictatorship. In many respects, the 20th century was a century of extremes. 2 world wars, totalitarian dictatorships, economic collapses, and revolutionary upheavals shaped the political and social landscape. All these developments left deep traces in the criminal system. Crime not only took on new forms, it was also politicized and instrumentalized to a previously unknown extent. At the same time, the boundaries between legal and illegal, between ordinary crime and state terror shifted. The 20th century shows how closely crime was linked to the crises and catastrophes of modernity. The First World War already changed the structures of crime considerably. The war led to a massive militarization of society, in which violence became commonplace. Millions of soldiers experienced killing, destruction, and devastation as normality at the front. After the end of the war, many returned traumatized and brutalized, which increased the willingness to use violence in civilian life. In addition, there was an economic hardship that encouraged the black market, smuggling, and theft in many countries. In Germany, which suffered from the reparations burden of the Treaty of Versailles, entire criminal networks emerged that dealt with illegal trade, currency smuggling, and extortion. The interwar period was marked by economic instability, which encouraged crime. The hyperinflation in Germany in 1923 meant that money became worthless in a very short time. In this situation, theft and fraud were booming, while black market transactions were often the only way to survive. In other countries, too, the Great Depression from 1929 onwards led to a dramatic increase in crime. Millions of unemployed people were desperately looking for income, and many turned to illegal activities. In the USA, for example, organized crime experienced an upswing during the Prohibition era. The sale and smuggling of alcohol became a billion-dollar business that made figures like Al Capone famous. Parallel to these forms of everyday crime, the importance of political violence grew in the interwar period. In many countries, extremist movements resorted to terrorist means to achieve their goals. Assassinations, street battles, and coup attempts shaped the time. In Italy, the fascists under Mussolini rose to power through violent actions. In Germany, the National Socialists used terror against political opponents to consolidate their position. Political crime became an instrument of the acquisition of power, and the state reacted with repression, which in turn produced new violence. With the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s, the relationship between the state and crime changed fundamentally. In dictatorships such as National Socialist Germany or the Stalinist Soviet Union, criminal law became a tool of political rule. Crimes were no longer just crimes such as theft or murder, but could also be dissenting opinions, criticism of the regime, or alleged disloyalty. Millions of people were criminalized even though they had not committed any classic crimes. Political trials, show trials, and mass arrests blurred the line between crime and dissidence. In National Socialist Germany, criminal law was systematically perverted. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 criminalized Jews solely on the basis of their origin. Homosexuality, antisocial behavior, or subversion of the armed forces were considered criminal offenses and led to concentration camp imprisonment or the death penalty. At the same time, the regime deliberately allowed certain criminality if it served its own purposes. Violence against Jews, communists, or members of the opposition was not punished, but encouraged. The National Socialist judiciary was thus less a guardian of order than a tool of state-organized crime. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, too, criminal law was instrumentalized for political purposes. Millions of people were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary behavior or sabotage and deported to the gulags. Crime became a political construct that could be defined arbitrarily. At the same time, new forms of crime developed within the camps. Smuggling, extortion, and murder were part of everyday life in the gulags, where a separate hierarchy of criminals and politicals emerged. The Second World War brought about a new dimension of violence and crime. War crimes and crimes against humanity overshadowed conventional crime. Massacres, deportations, forced labor, and the Holocaust were crimes organized and carried out by states. They showed that in the 20th century, crime was not only a problem of individual perpetrators, but could also be committed on a gigantic scale by governments. The Nuremberg trials after the end of the war were the first to put state leaders and military officers on trial for such acts and coined the term crimes against humanity. At the same time, a wide range of everyday crime existed during the war. Black markets and smuggling flourished in the occupied territories, and many people were forced to break laws in order to survive. Deserters, looters, or collaborators were severely punished by the respective regimes, often with death. This once again showed how relative the concept of criminality was in times of war. Actions that would have been considered legitimate or even heroic in peacetime were now prosecuted as crimes, and vice versa. The post-war period brought a new confrontation with crime and law. In Europe, which was in ruins, the black market, prostitution, and theft flourished. At the same time, society had to deal with the crimes of the dictatorships. The Nuremberg trials and later trials against Nazi criminals laid the foundation for international criminal law. They made it clear that there are crimes that go beyond national laws and affect all of humanity. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the first half of the 20th century was an age in which crime and politics were inextricably interwoven. Crime was not only theft or murder, but could also mean resistance, dissidence, or simply belonging to a certain group. At the same time, it became apparent that states themselves could become perpetrators by abusing the law to legitimize crimes. The 20th century thus revealed the dark side of modernity, the ability to organize, systematize, and carry out crime on an unprecedented scale. Chapter 16. The 20th century too, organized crime, mafia, syndicates. The 20th century was not only an age of political violence, wars, and dictatorships, but also the heyday of organized crime. While crime had always occurred in groups and gangs, a form now developed that was characterized by professionalism, permanence, and international networking. Mafia, syndicates, and cartels became permanent fixtures of social reality. They no longer operated on the fringes, but penetrated legal structures, combined illegal business with legal enterprises, and built influential networks that influenced states, the economy, and culture. The roots of organized crime go back a long way. The mafia was particularly formative in Sicily, whose origins lie in the 19th century. A mixture of peasant secret societies, protection organizations, and criminal structures created a network that soon had enormous influence. The mafia saw itself as a family with fixed hierarchies, rituals, and rules. Confidentiality, omerta, loyalty, and violence formed its foundations. In a region where the state was weak and the population had little trust in state institutions, the mafia was able to offer protection, for a fee. In doing so, she filled a power vacuum that she created and exploited herself. In the United States, organized crime took on a new dimension during Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. The prohibition of alcohol opened up gigantic business opportunities. The smuggling, production, and distribution of alcohol became a billion-dollar business that gave criminals such as Al Capone in Chicago or Lucky Luciano in New York immeasurable power. Prohibition created a criminal ecosystem in which not only alcohol, but also gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking flourished. Violence between rival gangs shaped the cities, and corruption permeated the police, politics, and the judiciary. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the syndicates were already so well established that they were able to extend their power to other fields. The American mafia, often referred to as the Cosa Nostra, developed a model that is typical of modern organized crime. It was strictly hierarchical, had families, bosses, and soldiers, and it combined illegal business with legal structures. Construction companies, restaurants, or transport companies served as camouflage, money laundering, and a source of income. The role of the mafia in the trade unions was particularly influential. By controlling labor markets, transportation, and construction, it has been able to earn billions and wield political power. Powerful criminal organizations also emerged outside the USA and Italy in the 20th century. In Japan, the Yakuza, whose roots date back to the 17th century, developed into a modern syndicate. It is characterized by its own rituals, codes, and eye-catching symbolism, such as large-scale tattoos. The Yakuza was active in gambling, construction, drug, and human trafficking, and had close ties to Japanese politics and business. Unlike in other countries, it operated openly, maintained offices, and published magazines, a sign of its deep roots in society. In China and Southeast Asia, triads shaped the criminal landscape. These secret societies, which originally emerged from resistance movements against the Manchu dynasty, developed into powerful criminal organizations with international reach. They were active in the opium trade, human trafficking, protection racketeering, and later also in the international drug trade. Their structures were similar to those of other syndicates. Hierarchies, rituals, secrecy, and violence secured power and influence. With the rise of international drug trafficking since the 1970s, new players have gained in importance. In Latin America, drug cartels emerged that made enormous profits from the trade in cocaine and heroin. The Medellin cartel became particularly notorious in Colombia under Pablo Escobar. In the 1980s, it controlled a large part of the global cocaine market, earned billions, and waged a veritable war against the Colombian state. Assassinations, bombings, and murders of politicians and judges made it clear that organized crime claimed not only economic but also political power. The globalization of the 20th century opened up new opportunities for organized crime. Smuggling and human trafficking crossed national borders, and modern communication facilitated coordination and money laundering. American and Italian syndicates worked together as early as the interwar period, and later Asian, Latin American, and European networks merged. International police organizations such as Interpol were founded to counter this transnational threat. But the flexibility and adaptability of the syndicates made it difficult to fight them. A characteristic feature of organized crime in the 20th century was the penetration of legal structures. Criminals invested their profits in legitimate businesses, used banks to launder money, and bought political influence. Corruption was a central instrument. Police officers, judges, and politicians were bribed or intimidated, so that prosecution often came to nothing. This interdependence made it clear that organized crime was not only on the fringes of society, but also at the heart of business and politics. At the same time, the mafia and its modern counterparts became a cultural myth. Novels, films, and series shaped the image of crime syndicates. Works such as The Godfather by Mario Puzo or the films of the same name by Francis Ford Coppola made the mafia a world-famous icon. It was romanticized as a family business with honor and tradition, even if the reality was one of brutality, murder, and blackmail. This cultural processing shows how much organized crime had become part of modern society, not only as a threat, but also as a fascination. This development made it clear that crime in the 20th century could no longer be combated by the police and the judiciary alone. It was a global, political, and economic phenomenon that required new strategies. International cooperation, new laws against money laundering and organized crime, and special forces were reactions to this. But despite all efforts, organized crime remains a central problem to this day. Chapter 17. White-collar crime in the age of globalization. When you think of crime, images of theft, burglary, violence, or organized crime often come to mind. But in the 20th century, a form of crime came to the fore that did not take place in dark alleys, but in brightly lit offices and boardrooms, the so-called white-collar crime. The term was coined in 1939 by the American sociologist Edwin Sutherland, who in a famous speech pointed out that crime is not only a phenomenon of the lower classes, but that high-ranking businessmen, managers, and politicians also commit illegal acts that often cause greater damage than ordinary crimes. Sutherland's thesis shattered the hitherto dominant image of the criminal as a social outsider and presented crime as a problem for society as a whole that affects all social classes. White-collar crime includes a large number of offenses that are related to professional activity, companies, or state institutions. These include fraud, embezzlement, corruption, insider trading, price fixing, cartel formation, money laundering, and tax evasion. It is characteristic that they are usually committed without overt violence and yet cause enormous economic and social damage. While a burglary may cause a few €100 in damage, balance sheet falsification, systematic tax avoidance, or fraudulent financial transactions can cost billions and cause entire economies to falter. An example of the destructive effect of white-collar crime is the major financial scandals of the 20th century. In the US, the savings and loan crisis shook confidence in the banking sector in the 1980s. Numerous banks had engaged in risky and often fraudulent transactions that led to billions in losses and cost taxpayers enormous sums of money. Another notorious example is the Enron case in 2001, which is considered one of the biggest corporate scandals in history. The energy company had falsified its balance sheets for years, faked profits, and hid losses. When the fraud was exposed, the company collapsed, thousands lost their jobs, and investors suffered gigantic losses. In addition to companies and banks, the state itself is often involved in white-collar crime. Corruption in public authorities, party financing, and illegal enrichment of public officials are widespread worldwide. Especially in weak or authoritarian states, corruption is often systemic and affects almost all areas of public life. But political scandals are not uncommon even in democracies. The Watergate affair in the US showed how illegal practices can reach the highest levels of government, even if they were more of an abuse of power than classic economic fraud. The consequences of white-collar crime are serious. They not only lead to financial losses, but also undermine the population's trust in the economy and politics. When citizens feel that big companies and politicians can break the law with impunity, while small offenses are harshly prosecuted, a sense of injustice is created that threatens the legitimacy of the entire system. In addition, white-collar crime increases social inequality. The profiteers are usually wealthy anyway, while the costs are borne by the general public. Combating this form of crime is difficult because it involves complex structures, international interdependencies, and large financial resources. Investigators need expertise in business law, finance, and international cooperation. Institutions such as the US Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the OECD, and the EU have developed measures to combat corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion. But globalization makes control more difficult, as funds can be transferred across borders in seconds and many countries have an interest in acting as tax havens. Another aspect is that white-collar crime often remains invisible. It is rarely perceived as an immediate threat because it does not involve violence. Victims are not individuals, but entire societies that suffer from loss of revenue, unstable markets, or inefficient institutions. As a result, white-collar crime is often underestimated in the public perception, although its damage is far greater compared to classic crime. In retrospect, it is clear that the 20th century set the stage for white-collar crime on a global scale. With the emergence of multinational corporations, the liberalization of financial markets and technological networking, structures emerged that facilitated illegal practices. At the same time, the realization prevailed that crime does not only take place on the streets, but also in the executive floors. Sutherland's notion of white-collar crime was a milestone because it drew attention to this dimension and destroyed the illusion that crime was only a problem of the lower classes. Dealing with this form of crime remains a central challenge of modern society. Because as long as profits are valued higher than law and ethics, the temptation to circumvent laws will remain great. White-collar crime is therefore not only a legal problem, but also a moral one that is deeply rooted in the structures of business and politics. Chapter 18. Technology and Crime, Cybercrime, Digital Fraud. The rapid development of technology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has profoundly changed the face of crime. Where previously alleys, markets, and banks were the scenes of criminal acts, crime increasingly shifted to digital spaces. The advent of computers, the internet, and global networking has given rise to new forms of crime, which are now summarized under the term cybercrime. This development is not only an extension of traditional crimes, but in many respects a completely new dimension of crime that breaks down old categories and challenges states, companies, and individuals alike. Cybercrime refers to any form of crime committed using computers, networks, or digital technology. It ranges from simple scams to identity theft and complex attacks on state infrastructures. It is characteristic that the crime scenes are no longer bound by geographical borders. A hacker in Eastern Europe can plunder an account in the USA. An attack on a hospital in Germany can start from a server in Asia. This dissolution of boundaries makes cybercrime a global phenomenon that poses enormous problems for national legal systems. One of the earliest forms of digital crime was so-called hacking. As early as the 1970s and 1980s, computer enthusiasts experimented with penetrating systems, at first often out of curiosity or to test technical limits. But it soon developed into criminal practices. Hackers gained access to bank accounts, confidential data, or confidential communications. With the spread of the internet in the 1990s, the possibilities multiplied. Email fraud, phishing, and the theft of credit card information became commonplace. Phishing is still one of the most common methods of digital fraud today. This involves sending fake messages that appear to come from banks, companies, or authorities and are intended to trick victims into revealing personal data. Often, a single click on a link is enough to install malware on a computer or compromise credentials. With the increasing professionalization of such methods, entire industries of cybercrime have emerged in which perpetrators collect, sell, or use data for further crimes. Another field is the theft of intellectual property. In a world where knowledge and information are among the most valuable assets, companies and research institutions are attractive targets. Industrial espionage has reached a new level of quality in the digital age. Instead of stealing physical documents, it is sufficient to penetrate networks and copy data. States themselves are active in this area by spying on opposing companies or institutions in order to gain economic and political advantages. The line between state espionage and criminal activities is often blurred. Even more dangerous is the area of attacks on critical infrastructures. Energy suppliers, hospitals, transport systems, and government networks are potential targets of cyber attacks. Such attacks can not only cause economic damage, but also endanger human lives. Examples such as the attack with the Stuxnet computer virus, which sabotaged Iranian nuclear facilities, show that digital attacks have long been part of geopolitical conflicts. Ransomware attacks, in which data is encrypted and only released for a ransom, have also made headlines in recent years. Hospitals, municipalities, and businesses were paralyzed, and perpetrators often demanded payments in cryptocurrencies to disguise their identities. Cybercrime has also spawned new markets that are thriving on the so-called dark net. This hidden segment of the internet, accessible only with special software, provides platforms for trafficking drugs, weapons, forged documents, and stolen data. Online marketplaces like Silk Road became infamous for enabling a new way of anonymous, global commerce. The use of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin made these transactions even easier, as transactions are difficult to trace. The dark net is thus a digital equivalent of the black market, with the difference that its reach and anonymity are far greater. A particularly perfidious form of cybercrime is identity theft. Perpetrators use personal data such as names, addresses, social security numbers, or credit card details to conclude contracts, open accounts, or make purchases on behalf of their victims. This can have devastating consequences for those affected, as they not only suffer financial damage, but also take a long time to restore their identity. In view of the huge amounts of personal data stored in social networks, online shops, or government databases, this area is of ever-growing importance. Children and young people are also targets of digital crime. Cyberbullying, sextortion, and image abuse have increased in recent years. Perpetrators use the anonymity of the internet to blackmail or humiliate victims. International networks also disseminate depictions of sexualized violence against children, an area where prosecution is particularly difficult due to the global dimension. The fight against cybercrime poses enormous challenges for states and institutions. National police authorities quickly reach their limits when perpetrators are located abroad or servers are spread across several countries. That is why international cooperation is essential. Organizations such as Europol or Interpol have set up special departments that deal exclusively with cybercrime. At the same time, private companies are also required to secure their systems and cooperate with authorities. The boundary between state and private responsibility is often blurred here. One problem is that technological developments usually give criminals a head start. New technologies such as cloud computing, the Internet of Things, or artificial intelligence are opening up new attack surfaces. While security measures take time to establish themselves, perpetrators quickly exploit the vulnerabilities. As a result, new variants of malware, trojans, and attack methods are constantly emerging that bypass traditional defense mechanisms. Cybercrime is also so difficult to fight because it often remains invisible. Many companies shy away from making attacks public for fear of loss of reputation. Victims of online fraud or identity theft often don't notice the consequences until late. This creates a dark field that makes it difficult to grasp the true extent of the problem. In retrospect, it is clear that digitization has not abolished crime, but only transformed it. Old patterns such as fraud, extortion, or theft persist, but they are committed in a new form and with greater reach. The perpetrators are anonymous, globally networked, and technologically savvy. The victims are not just individuals, but entire societies whose dependence on digital infrastructure makes them vulnerable. Cybercrime is thus a mirror of the modern world. It shows that every technological achievement also has its downsides. Just as industrialization in the 19th century created new forms of crime, digitization creates new challenges in the 21st century. The fight against digital crime is therefore not only a task for the police and the judiciary, but also a challenge for society as a whole, which includes education, technology, and international cooperation. Chapter 19. Crime and Society Today: Prevention, Resocialization, Modern Penal Systems. Today's society faces a double challenge in dealing with crime. On the one hand, classic forms such as theft, robbery, or assault are still ubiquitous and put a strain on many people's sense of security. On the other hand, new forms of crime are emerging that are facilitated by technological developments, globalization, and social changes. Terrorism, cybercrime, white-collar crime, and organized crime show that crime is not a static phenomenon, but always adapts to social structures. Dealing with this variety of offenses requires not only effective repression, but also forward-looking prevention and approaches that go beyond punishment. A decisive change in recent decades concerns the understanding of prevention. For a long time, the idea that crime could be deterred by harsh penalties dominated. But studies and experience have shown that strictness alone is not enough. Rather, it is necessary to create conditions in advance that counteract criminal behavior. Prevention today means a variety of measures: social support for disadvantaged groups, educational programs, youth work, urban planning that promotes security, and technical measures such as surveillance cameras or better lighting in public spaces. In many Western countries, the concept of community policing has become established. The police should not only be perceived as a repressive body, but should act in close cooperation with citizens. The trust of the population is crucial here, because only if people perceive the police as a partner are they willing to report suspicious things or resolve conflicts peacefully. Programs of this kind have shown that local prevention work can actually reduce crime and strengthen the feeling of security. Another important starting point is the resocialization of offenders. While punishment used to be understood primarily as retaliation, the idea that recidivism prevention must be the focus is increasingly gaining ground. This is because the majority of perpetrators are released back into society after serving their sentence. If prisons are only places of detention, with no prospects for education, work, and social integration, there is a high probability that former prisoners will reoffend. Resocialization means giving prisoners the chance of a new start. This is done through vocational training, psychological support, addiction therapy, and social reintegration programs. Prisons play an ambivalent role in this context. On the one hand, they are considered indispensable for isolating dangerous criminals from society. On the other hand, their effectiveness is increasingly being critically questioned. In many countries, prisons are overcrowded, conditions are poor, and violence and drug use are widespread. Critics speak of a school of crime because prisons promote social networks of criminals and make reintegration more difficult. Reforms are therefore aimed at expanding alternative punitive measures. These include suspended sentences, community service, electronic ankle bracelets, or therapeutic measures. The aim is to make punishments more individual and proportionate and to use detention only where it is really necessary. Particular attention is paid to juvenile criminal law. Young people are particularly susceptible to criminal behavior, but at the same time they are also particularly susceptible to positive influences. That is why many states are relying on mitigating measures for young people, who are not primarily supposed to punish, but to educate. Educational institutions, assisted living, social training courses, and intensive support by social workers are intended to prevent young people from falling into a permanent criminal career. The idea behind this is that a society that catches young people at an early stage will produce less crime in the long term. The role of modern penal systems is not limited to the national framework. In a globalized world, international criminal law is also gaining in importance. Institutions such as the International Criminal Court in The Hague prosecute genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This makes it clear that crime is now not only seen as a domestic problem, but as a global phenomenon that requires international cooperation. States are also working ever more closely together on organized crime, terrorism, and cybercrime. Police organizations such as Europol and Interpol coordinate investigations across borders and create networks that are supposed to correspond to the transnational dimension of crime. At the same time, the relationship between freedom and security is a constant area of tension. Modern states are faced with the task of protecting their citizens without unduly restricting their fundamental rights. Surveillance technologies, biometric databases, and artificial intelligence offer new ways to fight crime, but raise questions about data protection and privacy. The discussion about how much security a society needs and how much freedom it is willing to sacrifice shapes the debates on criminal policy in the present. The perception of crime is strongly influenced by the media. News, films, and series shape ideas about how dangerous society is and which crimes are in the foreground. A distorted picture often emerges that fuels fear, even though crime rates in many Western countries have fallen in the long term. Headlines about spectacular crimes or terrorist attacks overlay statistical realities. Political decisions are often shaped by such perceptions, leading to calls for harsher penalties or more surveillance, even if this does not always correspond to the real problems. The social dimension of crime is also reflected in the fact that certain groups are more likely to be confronted with criminal prosecution. People from disadvantaged social classes, migrants, or ethnic minorities are disproportionately targeted by the police and the judiciary. This raises questions about discrimination and structural inequality. A modern criminal policy must therefore not only fight crime, but also ensure that it is done in a just and fair way. A growing area in criminal policy is so-called restorative justice. This approach aims to bring perpetrators and victims into dialogue and to actively work on the damage caused by a crime. Instead of relying solely on punishment, perpetrators should take responsibility and make amends. Victims, in turn, are given the opportunity to contribute their perspective and receive recognition for the suffering they have suffered. Such procedures are mainly used in cases in which the reintegration of the offender seems to make sense. They show that justice can be more than punishment. In retrospect, it can be said that today's society is looking for complex ways of dealing with crime that go beyond simple concepts. Punishment alone is no longer enough to ensure security. Rather, the focus is on an interplay of prevention, resocialization, and international cooperation. Modern penal systems try to understand the offender as a human being who can not only be punished, but also improved. At the same time, it is recognized that crime is deeply rooted in social structures and can only be reduced in the long term through comprehensive social measures. The history of crime is a history of humanity itself. Since the earliest communities, in which taboos, rituals, and oral rules determined coexistence, crime has accompanied the development of civilization. Wherever people lived in communities, the need arose to regulate behavior, protect property, limit violence, and enforce norms. Crime has always been the flip side of order, a mirror in which societies recognize their fears, hopes, and values. The confrontation with it was never only of a legal nature, but always also socially, politically, and culturally. A look back at the centuries shows that order and chaos were in a constant interplay. In ancient times, the first legal codes were created, such as the Codex Hammurabi in Mesopotamia or the 12 Tables in Rome. They were supposed to bring order, but at the same time they reflected the chaos that reigned without them. In the Middle Ages, blood feuds and feuds were an expression of a world in which state order was weak, and it was only the gradual development of central legal systems that created structures that curbed violence. In the early modern period, on the other hand, the cruelty of the punishments, the severity of the witch trials, and the use of torture reveal the attempt to banish the threatening through overwhelming force, an attempt that often itself produced new forms of chaos. The Enlightenment marked the beginning of a new chapter in which rationality and humanity came to the fore. Punishment should no longer be arbitrary, but a calculable measure. Nevertheless, the 18th century also showed that the struggle between order and chaos could never be finally decided. Crime changed with social structures, and each new order brought forth new forms of disobedience. The 19th century with its industrialization revealed this dynamic particularly clearly. While the police, prisons, and criminology created modern structures of order, new criminal milieus grew in the slums that defied old rules. In the 20th century, the ambivalence between order and chaos took on extreme forms. Dictatorships transformed criminal law into an instrument of political oppression and turned millions of innocent people into criminals. At the same time, organized crime in the form of the mafia, syndicates, and cartels broke up new spheres of power that existed parallel to state structures. Finally, the development of technology led to a dissolution of the boundaries of crime, which has now reached global dimensions. Every new form of order, whether national state, international organization, or digital regulation, is challenged by new forms of chaos. At the heart of this development is the question of justice. Punishment has always been more than a mere reaction to crime. It was an expression of what a society felt was just. In archaic cultures, justice often meant revenge or reparation. In religious times, it was a divine act. In modern societies, it is a rational, legally justified measure. But the search for justice is never complete. Debates about the death penalty, resocialization, surveillance, and freedom show that every society must renegotiate how to strike a balance between order and individual freedom. Today, we are facing challenges that take the eternal struggle between order and chaos into new dimensions. Cybercrime makes it clear that order can no longer be established only in physical space, but also in virtual space. Organized crime proves that state order reaches its limits when economic power flows into criminal structures. Global threats such as terrorism or money laundering show that no state can guarantee order on its own, but that international cooperation is required. At the same time, the question of the legitimacy of order remains. If security is bought with massive surveillance, there is a threat of a new imbalance in which order itself becomes an instrument of chaos because it destroys freedom. The history of crime makes it clear that crime can never be completely eliminated. It is a companion of civilization, just as shadow accompanies light. But it is malleable. Its shape, its meaning, and its effect depend on the structures that societies create. The fight against them is not so much a war that can be won as a constant adaptation, a process of balance between protection and freedom, between law and justice, between individual responsibility and collective order. In retrospect, it becomes clear that each epoch has produced its own forms of crime and its own answers. No solution was final. Every order was challenged by new forms of chaos. But at the same time, history shows that societies have repeatedly found ways to respond to threats, improve structures, and reorganize coexistence. The eternal struggle between order and chaos is therefore not only a story of crime, but also a story of human creativity, adaptability, and the tireless pursuit of justice. Thus, the journey through the history of crime does not end with a line, but with the realization that order and chaos are inextricably linked. They are the two poles between which human life moves. The struggle between them is endless, but it is precisely in this endlessness that the possibility of constant renewal lies. Every generation has to find its own answers, and this shows that the history of crime is